Hey everybody, welcome back to theclinicaltrialsguru.com. Again, it's theclinicaltrialsguru.com. So every now and then I do an interview. I used to do lots more. I don't know why I haven't done so many in the past. But drugdev.org, I've been talking about them for a long time on this blog. Actually, Ibs, I interviewed Melissa Easy back in 2012 when DrugDev, I believe, first started coming out on the radar. So I've always been interested in drug dev and its initiatives. And today I'm lucky, really lucky, to have Ibs Mahmood, CEO of DrugDev.org. And also, you recently won a Disruptor Award, PM360. So what was that award for? Disrupting Clinical Research?
That's exactly right, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And when did you join DrugDev as CEO?
November 2011. So
Okay.
I think I grew the company headcount by around 30% from two to three
Mm-hmm.
back
And
then.
yeah, and the initial mission was to connect investigators and sponsors closer together to kind of make it easier for sponsors to select research sites and investigators by having some kind of central data bank, right?
Yeah, I think when you're a small company, you have an idea that there's something wrong with the world, and you have an idea that you might be able to help. But you iterate, you try and zero in on where the real problem is and therefore what you can do to help. And it was interesting in the preamble before we went live, as we were talking, you were saying that you took over running a site and you couldn't believe that there was no one out there talking about sites and no resources for you to find out about what you can do to make your site better or to make it better known. And I guess we felt the same thing, that like if you think of the site staff, the investigators as really the foundation stones on which all clinical trials are run. And I say all, I mean, there'll be precious few that will be run direct to patient anytime soon. So let's just assume that, it's all about sites. It's astonishing how poorly the industry seems to look after them, or at least on a global long-term basis, like how they try and maintain those relationships. Any other industry, if the linchpin was known, then everyone would bend over backwards to make sure they knew who they were and what they needed. Whereas our industry seemed to be very focused on them at the moment of running a trial, but no one was out there trying to maintain the long-term relationships. So Melissa and I knew there was something in a business to try and fill that gap. And I think what we discovered by late 2011, early 2012, was that was probably a dating agency, a single point to connect all the investigators to all the people that wanted investigators, so farmers and CROs. And that was really the genesis of the original DrugDev. And today, whilst it's a small part of DrugDev, that business continues, it continues to grow, and it's really important to us because everything we do is about improving the life of the site. And so if we don't know who they are and what they want, how can we try and improve their lives?
Right. Yeah, it's really interesting, even when talking to Melissa. I mean, uh, especially in this industry, but I think in any industry, there's kind of like a catch-22. And in this case, you needed a lot of investigators to register because that would make it a valuable product for sponsors. But no investigator is going to register unless sponsors are actually using it. So what came first? Did you guys have the relationships with the sponsors, or was it just a matter of getting as many investigators to sign up and then presenting that to the sponsors? I've always been curious as to what came first.
Yeah, it was iterative. So the original seed for the network, and we call it a network because it's a living thing, it's dynamic, investigators join and leave, it's not just a database. But the original seed for that network were, and you'd have to ask Melissa for the detailed details, but it was a few hundred investigators that came out of a large longitudinal study, I think a registry study that Melissa was running. So
Wow.
she just asked them and said, do you want to go on there? And I think it might have been an opt-out as opposed to an opt-in, so she just put them on there. And so she started with a few hundred, so that was like the little kickstart. And then, we were able to use that small list to go sort of almost door to door with pharma companies saying, hey, would you have use for a well-characterized list of investigators? And, with the benefit of hindsight, it was obvious that they did have a use, but it surprised us at the time how interested they were. And so that list of investigators started to get trial opportunities from our website.
Mm-hmm.
And we know today that investigators are an extraordinarily mixed bunch of people. They have different priorities, they speak different languages, they have different needs. But the one thing that binds them all together, and this is kind of like a really obvious statement, but it's wanting trial opportunities. So when they started getting trial opportunities through the website, they told other investigators. And that's how it started to grow. They told other investigators, it was more interesting to pharma companies, they gave them more trial opportunities. And one thing grew with the other. So between late 2008 and the point that I joined, late 2011, the network grew by itself from a few hundred to 60 to 70,000. And today it's I think it's about 80,000.
Right.
So I think it's kind of plateaued. My guess is that there's only around 20 or 30,000 that do the majority of the studies in the world that are sponsor-led studies. But there is a sort of a continuous turnover of other investigators who want to be on the site. So that's why I think it sort of settles around 80,000.
80,000.
Interestingly, if you look at the number of investigators that have ever worked, or let's say in the last 5 years, for top 5 major pharma, it's more like a couple of 100,000. And we can come back to why I might know that.
Yeah, we'll definitely come back to that. I just did a video on how pharma can make clinical research process easier, at least finding the studies, and I think DrugDev.org is playing a huge role in that. But the biggest
I hope so. Yeah.
I think so. The biggest obstacle in this industry is recruitment. We get studies, most trials are delayed. Investigators, maybe brand new investigators, have a tough time recruiting. And one of the things pharma can do, at least in my opinion, is to bring on new investigators who have never done trials before but want to do trials. Thank you. And then they have a big database of patients there that they can actually enroll into the trials. So drugdev.org, I think, is making it easier than ever. I mean, when I started this in 2005, you had to get studies the old-fashioned way. You had to call people up, send cold emails. Now, sites have it so easy, brand new sites. First of all, the first challenge is to get them to know about drugdev.org. But once they do that, I mean, Sarah Merkel, she's become my best friend. I don't know her official title there, but I deal with her every day on multiple emails, and I know a lot of my other sites do as well. Yeah. It's never been easier for an investigator, whether you're brand new or you have a small site or even a big site, to get studies. They almost come passively now, and that was not the case before drugdev.org.
Yeah. I think there's 3 ways to drive great patient recruitment. One, give the sites great molecules. It's really obvious. People tend to forget that. Okay. 2, make sure that everybody knows what all the opportunities are. Right. So make it an efficient marketplace between the sites and the people who want to hand out the clinical trials. And 3, absolutely minimize the barriers to doing a clinical trial. Okay. So let's just take those sort of one by one. And there's a lot of other noise around patient recruitment. Oh, let's do cool stuff on the internet. Let's shout and shout and shout at patients, and let's somehow think that patients are going to completely change their view on clinical trials overnight. Yeah, all those things I think will happen. Although my guess is they will happen outsid our industry.
Right,
I think
but these 3 that you mentioned are very practical things.
Well, and I think they're much more real, right? So if we deal with those one at a time, how do we absolutely minimize the barrier to doing a clinical trial? Well, we just make the process really simple. Okay, the process of running a clinical trial has grown up through history, through 50 or 60 years of clinical trials becoming increasingly formalized and lots of regulation. Okay, that's the wrong way to design an efficient process. The right way to design an efficient process is just to sit down with a blank piece of paper and say, okay, we need this many patients, we need this much data. How are we going to do that? Okay. And unfortunately, it's far too late for anyone just to try and do that. So my view is that the only way we can do that is by getting the industry to adopt technology. So if we drive technology adoption, we will drive de facto standards in the way clinical trials are run. Put it another way, if everybody does everything in the same way, it becomes a standard. A
Right.
bit like what Uber's done for
hmm
taxis,
hmm
you know.
hmm So, what is the most important technologies for clinical research?
So it's using technologies to drive standards, but the key is not the technology. The key is to pick the right areas in which to drive standards. So let me give you an example. When we were talking in the preamble, you said that you had an extraordinary opportunity to take over the reins of a site because the current owners of the site basically were waiting to get paid. They knew they were going to get paid. They just were waiting to
I
get
think
paid,
they
and
knew
so
they
the
were. Yeah.
right, and the site had, I'm assuming, had a cash flow problem, right?
Yes.
Well, what if everyone just got paid in the exact same way with the exact same timing? And maybe the time it would be great if it was, a week after you did the work. But even if it was 2 months after, if you knew categorically that you would definitely get paid 2 months after, and that if you knew that there was a single website that you could go to, a portal, that told you that you were going to get paid this by Novartis and this by Janssen and this by Quintiles,
Right.
we'd remove all of that. And
hmm
indeed, it would make it much easier for you to, manage your own internal financial expenses. So, with it implicit in what I just said is that there has to be an agreement of. Just hold on one sec.
Sure.
There has to. I'm being kicked out of my hotel
Ah,
room.
nice. It's checkout time.
That's all right. Yeah, not quite. So yeah, implicit in what I'm saying is that we have to get to a point where everyone gets paid in one way. But here's the thing: the industry doesn't want to pay you in five different ways. The site, I'm guessing, doesn't really care if the money's coming from Novartis or Quintiles. They
Right.
just care that they know.
hmm
The technology is simply the enabler, but it's not like in other situations where the technology is really the thing that's changing the game, right? So the technology that sits inside Google Maps is mind-bendingly clever, right? The technology that sits inside payments, and I'm going to get in trouble with my payments colleagues here, but it shouldn't be that clever. It really should just be, well, this needs to happen, then this needs to happen, and then this needs to happen. Let's just have a piece of software that tells you when all those things are going to happen. And then somehow, let's make it so that everyone's using the same piece of software,
hmm
right?
hmm
Do
Yep.
you see the subtle difference? I think in that way, we can drive a simple and standard way to do all the different activities in the clinical trial. And if we drive them with technology, and I happen to believe we will, we're going to end up with what I would call the operating system for clinical trials. Windows for clinical trials or iOS for clinical
Right.
trials. And again, there's only two ways really. I mean, maybe there's Windows, maybe there's the mobile Windows, but basically there's Android and there's iOS.
hmm
There's two ways of doing stuff on your phone. They both work just as well. And because they've drive standards, we're able now to all interact in terms of calendar invites, in terms of knowing when we're going to, having an email, sending messages, whatever it is. That's all happened on phones. We need the same thing to happen in the clinical trials process. And so the sites always know what they're doing.
As
And one
long as
day,
it's not Windows Vista, I think we'll all
yeah,
be happy.
exactly. Well, you see, also implicit in what I'm saying is that it doesn't necessarily have to be the best technology. It just has to be the one that works that everybody's using. And so I actually think that there is a wonderful we're at a wonderful moment in history where for a lot of reasons, and a lot of this comes down to money, but let's just say a lot of reasons, organizations like Transcelerate exist. Organizations where the industry is finally coming together to drive standards in the way that clinical trials are done. I mean, people are working together, which would be almost unimaginable 5 or 10 years ago. So you've got the people at the top, the really powerful people at the bosses of development organizations or of clinical operations at large pharmaceutical companies saying, we want to do this. You've got the people doing the work, the worker bees, the clinical ops staff, and the people at the sites saying, yeah, we want one way to be paid. And then you've got DrugDev and you've got many other great niche technology companies saying, and we got the technologies. And so all we have to do is people like us have to just keep battling away to try and get our technologies adopted. it doesn't really matter if DrugDev wins all of it. You know, there's plenty of room for lots of standards to emerge.
Right.
And then people at the top saying to the pharma execs, it's okay just to use technology to get stuff done.
Yeah.
That all comes together. 5 years from now, we'll have that operating system. And 5 years from now, you won't be wondering about whether or not to do the clinical trial because you can't face the admin. And you won't be grabbing the first molecule you can because you're worried that you won't get another opportunity because we'll have an efficient marketplace. Right? That's critical. Mm-hmm. And the third thing that will happen is we'll be willing to try clinical trials even if we're not an experienced investigator. So you'll have a situation where rarer diseases, where there mightn't be trials very often, the best investigators are not investigators at all.
Right, they're research naive investigators.
Right, and you just say, well, you can do this because all you need to do is download this operating system and basically you just follow the process and you'll get there. And a lot of them want to do it. A lot of them want to help their patients.
Yeah.
Or they want to make a little bit of extra money, whatever it is. And we'll give them the means to do it instead of this sort of Brobdingnagian task of paperwork.
Now, how much a part of the entire process that you just mentioned is DrugDev trying to get into? I know you guys started as a data bank to connect investigators with sponsors, but are you getting into actual clinical trial operations now?
Yep. So we want to be able to do everything that happens in a clinical trial.
All right.
Go ahead.
What are your thoughts on remote monitoring, risk-based monitoring? Are you guys involved in bringing forth any technologies in that space?
Yep. So we don't have any technology for remote-based monitoring. In terms of the algorithms that go into risk-based monitoring, we're certainly looking at a couple of technologies right now.
Okay.
I should say that DrugDev's approach is either to buy or build. Right? And the reason that we're open to that is because we know that the industry wants to change. We know it has to change, but we also know that it has incredible momentum. Like, think of it as the flywheel, right? It takes so long to slow down the flywheel and then to get it to turn the other way and then to start. But once it's moving, it'll tend to carry on. So in the same way, you know, we could have our innovation lab turn out an amazing product tomorrow. It could take years before it gets to any kind of critical mass in the industry. And in the meantime, a really poor technology, which is going to damage the industry, may have taken hold. So what we will be very open to is acquiring companies with meaningful footprint already in the space, and then perhaps rewriting the technology that is at the core of that, right? So we bought CFS Clinical because they were the dominant player in the payments space.
Payments, that's right. I remember receiving payments from them.
Right, and I think at the time they were doing 90-something% of all the payments that pharma and CRO wasn't doing, and yet they weren't well known. So we helped them with marketing, and you know their system was ready for their next version, their software as a service version, which we've done. Right, so in that way we're able to get a really great piece of software out there without having to start at zero. So in the same way, we're looking at a couple of different takes on the risk-based monitoring space, either buying niche technologies or buying companies which have a meaningful footprint, and then either rewriting the software or just going with their software. But you asked me today. You asked me, you know, what aspirations do we have or what capabilities we have. I think if you look at the Trial Networks platform, it does. What's the best way to put this? It helps you run the process at the site for most of the activities at the site. So it's got workflow systems, it's got learning management systems, and it has sort of, for want of a better phrase, motivational behavioral systems, like, you know, knowing how you're ranking against other sites, or recognition and certification for doing really well in the study. I mean, it was designed by some extraordinarily smart computer scientists and medics who realized that what we need is SAP for clinical trials, and that's what they built. So it does many of the processes at the site. But there's still a lot of room for extra capabilities to be added to it. And one of them it didn't do was payments. And so the new payments module for CFS fits into the Trial Networks platform. Right? In the same way, we have a set of tools that will be coming out next year that help the site maintain their relationship with the patient.
Retention.
Right,
Mm,
exactly. So, because we think everything I'm talking about helps with recruitment. I think talking about patient recruitment as a separate entity, I think is naive, right?
right.
It comes to those three things I just said. But retention, yeah, there's some real things you can do to help the site with retention. So, for example, how can you do consent in a much more intelligent way? And how can you manage consent and do reconsent in a really smart way, right? So we're binders that a patient would expect during a clinical trial, right? So when am I supposed to be where? What pills am I supposed to be? How do I connect with the site staff? That kind of thing. And again, it's beautiful, it's simple, it's powerful, and it's ready, let's say, to drive a standard. It mightn't be the standard that arrives, but it's at least ready, and it fits hand in glove with stated objectives for Transcelerate. They said just a few months ago that they are I believe, maybe we should check this later, but I believe that they put out an announcement saying that they're looking at the consent space. Right. So again, it's very timely that a little worker company like DrugDev is really trying to help with driving those standards out there.
Right. Now, in regards to this consenting process, is this a e-consent or is it
Yep.
just reminding the site to consent them?
No, no, it's state of the art e-consent. But consent in isolation is a cool gadget, right? Consent as a part of a broader patient retention system is powerful.
Mm-hmm.
And again, you start plugging that in with patient payments, with investigator
Right.
payments, with all the activity at the site. Again,
Everything integrates, right? So it
yeah.
seems like
So,
the
so
idea
we're
is,
missing two or three big chunks. We're missing two or three big chunks, but we're looking at them and expect some acquisitions next year.
okay. And what chunks are you missing?
Well, definitely the whole patient retention piece for the site. Everything we do is about the site. So the way we think
I was
is
just gonna say that is, it
we're
seems
obsessed.
like everything you're doing
Yeah,
is site focused, right?
yeah, yeah. So think of it like Google's obsessed with you and wants to provide everything you need in your life. Whether you want to buy stuff, know the weather, know how to get somewhere, have your emails, have your calendar, right? In that way, there's a symbiotic relationship because you're happy to use Google and Google gets value from you because it understands you and then is able to sell you to the world, right? Well,
Right.
we've just picked a much smaller and, with no disrespect, much more valuable population in the site, right? So
Right.
there's only 100,000 or so of them, and we want to provide everything that they want for free,
Is that
so that
100,000 in the US or in the world?
well, so it it's in the world, but like I said earlier, my guess is there's only around 20 or 30,000 that do. Think of it as a histogram, right, with a
Right.
long
Right.
arrow on it, right? So my guess is there's 20 or 30,000 that do most of the work. But if you're really into this, I would suggest you do a follow-up interview with Elisa Cascade, who runs our data solutions business unit, and her knowledge is encyclopedic. I would just be careful what question you ask because she will talk to you for hours on the various machinations and statistics
I will.
of
I think I
that
should
world.
interview her.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. And
I'll be in touch afterwards.
yeah, absolutely. And she's passionate and brilliant on that exact subject.
Hmm.
And I think it's also worth mentioning that Transcelerate gets this, and they have been working very hard with our support, but primarily with Cognizant, to build a single site website, the Shared Investigator Portal, or Shared Investigator Platform. Sorry, I'm not exactly sure. It's SIP basically. Cognizant is building that for the members of Transcelerate who want to use it, and many of them will. And in that way, they will de facto drive a single sign-on for the industry and a single workspace for all investigators to go in there and say, hey, what trials am I working on at the moment? And what should I be doing today in that particular trial? And we help them with that in that we provide a chunk of the data back end to that system. It's called the Investigator Registry, and it's a piece of technology that grew out of our investigator data bank.
Hmm.
Okay, but I believe that effort is an effort to plug together lots of bits of technology to drive standards. So in other words, they are living the vision that we are trying to do ourselves. And again, we're very happy to work with Transcelerate to help them to do that.
Now, since the advent of CROs, and I'm going to ask you about CRO buy-in, are you having a lot of CROs using drugdev.org?
Yeah, yeah. I don't know the percentage breakdown today, but I think it's about half and half. The sort of our customer base. I don't think most CROs see us as competition, right?
Okay.
Because We don't have any monitors, and we don't run any clinical trials. Maybe it's a little bit disingenuous to say that, because it's like, who actually pays ultimately is often still the pharma company. But a typical situation might be that you've got a pharma company, they use a CRO, and then they say to the CRO, but would you use these guys for payments? And we work very happily alongside the CRO, and we do in many, many situations. Or they might say to another CRO, can you use the trial networks platform to run the trial? And we will find that the CRO staff say more positive things around our platforms than the pharma staff do, because they're the ones using it.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So we find very little pushback, very little indeed pushback from the people who actually run the trials at the CRO. At the senior levels of CRO, I think there is a mixed bag. I think there's around 2/3, something like that, are technology ambivalent. So they're kind of saying, well, we'll do what the pharma company wants. We'll use the pharma's technology, or we'll use DrugDev's, or we'll use someone else's.
Right.
And we will just focus on clinical excellence. And a few that I think differentiate themselves based on technology. So again, this is just my opinion. I'm not making any statements about this company, but Parexel, right? They have Parexel Informatics,
Mm-hmm.
and that's a real brand, and it's a decent sized company, and it's impressive, and their capabilities in IVR, for example, that they got when they acquired ClinPhone, are, I think, industry leading. I wouldn't like to say who's better than them, right, in that space, but that's pure technology, right?
Right.
Now, one day maybe DrugDev will acquire an IVR, and maybe we'll go head to head with those guys on that. And if we did, our argument would be, it's part of an integrated system, and it's part of an industry standard, and it's easier for everyone to use Switzerland DrugDev than it is to use one from a CRO. Now, that's a little disingenuous, because actually quite often other CROs do use other CRO technologies. In the case of ClinPhone, I think it's such an industry standard that, maybe that will always be the one, and maybe, I don't know, I have no idea, but maybe Quintiles has no problem at all using Parexel if that's what they're told by their client, as opposed to, what was it, Senduit, which is, I think, their own IVR technology, So it's a mixed bag, but I'd say 2/3, I would say, have the enlightened view that I don't think technology as a way to differentiate a CRO is a long-term game.
Mm-hmm.
I think the ways you differentiate is just being bloody good at doing clinical trials, and really good at project management.
Right. Yeah, because it seems like for the early onset of the CRO business, so to speak, one of their competitive advantages was having these site relations. And now DrugDev offers that access to these sites directly to the sponsor. So I was always just curious about how the CROs feel about DrugDev.org.
Right. Well, so I was making a broad comment about technology, and I think the industry is increasingly seeing DrugDev as Switzerland, just like they see metadata and IMS and
For EDC.
Oracle.
Mm-hmm.
For different things, right? IMS is obviously not for EDC. IMS is for other stuff, right? But it's IMS is not competing with Icon for a clinical trial, right? So it's okay. We can use them. But in the very specific particle trial of the feasibility of, are there the sites out there, and do we have the relationships with them? I think the days where a CRO says, my list is bigger than yours, have to be numbered.
I think so too. I think the value going forward, and this makes an interesting discussion for maybe a longer interview, but is technology allows for integration of a lot of services. So one of the things sites really hate is having 15 different vendors for a study, right?
Yeah.
And I think one of DrugDev.org's core competencies or key value prop is the fact that they can integrate maybe 2 or 3 of those, and as time goes on, maybe more. And that's something that the CROs, quite honestly, haven't been able to do in the last 15 years. Although technology is accelerating now faster than ever, that's not going to change. So I do see more technologies integrating and maybe having just 2 or 3 key vendors for one clinical trial as opposed to 12 to 15.
Yeah, but I don't think it's their fault, actually, because almost the way I like the way you ask things in a provocative way. It's much more fun than the boring journalism you normally get. But I think the truth is that a CRO does what a pharma company tells it to do, and so if Merck likes one type of technology, they'll use it, right? It's kind of not their job. You have to come from outside, and you have to actually have an angle in order to be, and I'm going to use this word, arrogant enough to assume that we can, as a little old drug dev, try and drive standards, right? I think the way we can is because we've got the ear of the site, and because we have lots of capital behind us, so we can go and buy the best to build something that covers all of the capabilities in clinical trial. And I think, quite frankly, we continue to get a really positive reception from CROs, because they're like, yeah, great, you sort all that out. We just want to run the trials.
Right.
And actually what you're doing, DrugDev, is making our clinical trial process easier, and therefore cheaper, and therefore improving our margins in a world where the pharma companies are increasingly saying, no, it's not on a cost plus, it's here's your money, go run the trial.
Right.
So if they can do it more efficiently, then that's good for them, and I know that the big CROs are thinking in that way, absolutely. And I think really the only technologies that they're thinking about buying today are ones that really either directly improve efficiencies for them internally. So I would have thought something like Firecrest is an impressive piece of kit for running ICONS trials very efficiently, and a great marketing tool for them. But also, things like Acurian, at PPD.
Right.
I mean, you could say, oh, hang on, but that's a technology. Why should one CRO have it? Well, but really it isn't. It's a service as well, right? So you could say it's part of the service that they provide. So there is a little bit of a grey line there. But I mean, I'm biased, obviously, but ultimately, I do think that there is going to be an emerging set of standard tech that everyone uses for the process of running clinical trial, just like it's emerged for the data layer of running clinical trial. But let's face it, metadata, Oracle, they're pretty much dominating that space now, right? So we've got a standard, and that's not such a bad thing, is it, right? So that you've only got either a metadata login or an Inform login, probably, or a REDCap login.
Right. Yeah, no, I definitely see the future as data-driven. I mean, it's apparent. This past decade, maybe everything was more search-driven. Now that everyone's kind of gotten accustomed with that, the next evolution is data, having data, and how do you interpret that? And we're seeing that with risk-based monitoring.
I think what you're saying is right, but I'm making it a different process. It's if you think of a clinical trial as people, process, and data. What I'm saying is that 15 years ago, there was no standardization in anything. I think today, in that data layer, there is standardization. I think metadata and Oracle are de facto driving a standard, which is you're either using one or the other. I mean, there are others, and there are great bits of EDC technology out there, fantastic, but they're kind of owning most of that space, right? I think on the people layer, we've seen continuous consolidation of the CROs, and so that eventually most trials will be run by 5 CROs. So the people piece will be done by one of those 5 companies or in-house. DrugDev's playing in that middle layer, the process layer. Is there standardization in the way that clinical trials are run? Not the data, not the way. And the answer is not really, but it's starting to happen.
Yes.
Payments is one example of that. Workflow is another example of that. Patient engagement is another part of that. We're going to make bets in all of those spaces, with them together into a single platform that is entirely compliant with Transcelerate standards and data. So that's the data of process, not the data of data. Okay?
Right.
And in that way, I think we've got a shot at driving that standard that everybody wants in the middle.
Very interesting. It's going to be extremely interesting for me to follow this, and for all of us in the industry to follow this as the years progress. Last thing, because I know you got to run, you said you guys are growing either by growing small businesses or purchasing, acquiring, right? And you have an incubator. Is that correct? You guys have like some kind of startup incubator, lab incubator?
Yeah, correct. So we're our spiritual leader is a guy called Hugo Stevenson, and when I say spiritual leader, he is a three-way. He is a very unusual combination of 3 different things. He is a hair on fire entrepreneur, and I say that as a pun because if you understand that's a little bit of a joke. But anyway, he's a hair on fire entrepreneur. He is an experienced clinical investigator, so he's a PI right now. He's doing 3 studies out there in Melbourne, Australia. And he's an experienced farmer. I think a vice president or senior vice president at Quintiles for about 10 years.
Really?
He ran late phase and drug safety, among other things. And he ran his own CRO in Australia before that. So he gets all 3. Oh, and he's an experienced software coder. So it's unusual to have all these things in one brain. And so he's the perfect person companies and say, okay, what can we do? How does it fit in? How can we adjust the tech to make it perfect? And i.e., how do we make the go-to-market strategy of that business such that the industry is going to find it irresistible and we can drive a standard? And the best example of that is what he's done working with Secure Consent. Our friends down in Frederick, Maryland, who had a cool piece of technology in e-consent that he's now turned into something that I think is going to be an industry smasher.
Mm-hmm. Seems
Now,
like it.
if you want to have a really entertaining interview Hugo.
I will. I got to interview him and Alicia next. That's on my to-do list.
Elisa,
Elisa.
Take lots of caffeine before you talk to Hugo, though, because and Elisa, actually, their brains work very fast. But
Right.
you have a lot of fun.
Well, thank you, Ibs. And I guess any speaking engagements coming up? Any conferences? I know you're on the
I don't
speaking
know.
circuit regularly. I'll be
Yeah,
at Scope in February, so hopefully we can meet if you're there.
yeah. I'd be surprised if I'm not at Scope or even speaking at Scope. Yeah, I mean, look, Dan, it's fun because we're trying to change something, and it's always fun to see change actually happen, to see people smile when you actually help them make their lives easier. But actually, this is much more than that, isn't it? Because in other industries, you do it and you kind of feel good about yourself that, I don't know, the call center for the cell phone company works 5% more efficiently. This is a big deal.
Right.
If you do what we think you can do, which is half the cost of clinical trials, do you think that Novartis or Merck or Janssen or Lilly will spend half as much? No way. They'll spend the exact same. So what are they going to do if it costs half as much to run the clinical trials? They're going to run twice as many.
Right.
And what does that mean? It means twice as many life-saving medicines hitting the market. And that's kind of cool. I'm sure that's part of the reason why you're doing it, right?
That's right. Yeah, you got to always keep the big picture in mind. One of my first videos ever was let's not lose track of the real reason why we're in this business. It's because clinical trials at the end of the day improve or save lives. I mean, that's the purpose of clinical research.
Exactly.
Yeah. So thank you, Ibs. Anything else you want to add before we go?
No, that's great. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
I appreciate it. Ibs Mahmood, CEO of DrugDev.org, and I'm looking forward to meeting you at Scope, okay?
Great. Take care. Talk
Take
soon.
care. Bye-bye.